To begin today with the possibility of a war. We're not talking about a trade war, and we're not talking about a Cold War. What we're talking about is a real war between the United States and China. Now, under most circumstances, we would not dare to make this suggestion because, well, it would seem almost hyperbolic, right? Why then are we leading our newscast today with the suggestion of this potential scenario? Well, because two world leaders are coming out and saying that this is what they think could happen. And these are leaders who know the region, the Asian Pacific. Both men are Australian, and both have held the position of Prime Minister of Australia. First, there's the former Prime Minister, who happens to also be a China scholar. His name is Kevin Rudd. You see him there. He has just penned an editorial in the Foreign Affairs Journal where he says that the risk of an armed conflict between the United States and China in the next 3 months is especially high. Then, as you might expect, Australia's current Prime Minister, there he is, Scott Morrison. He was asked to comment on his predecessor's statement, and surprisingly, he basically agreed. Morrison said that the hot war between the United States and China was, quote, previously inconceivable and not considered even possible or likely, but not anymore. Two Australian prime ministers, one a former, the other a present, sounding an alarm they seem to want the whole world to hear. So the question is, should we be heeding the warning, or should we simply see it as an alarmist view? We're going to answer that question. Are Australia's concerns over a war between the U.S. and China justified? For almost a full year now, we here on this newscast have watched as relations between the United States and China have deteriorated. There have been arrests, there have been sanctions, there have been tariffs. There have been military exercises and interactions in open waters between military. And that was all before the COVID-19 pandemic that has one side now accusing the other of purposely making the world sick to gain an economic advantage. Wow. We begin our newscast today with RT correspondent John Huddy.
Hot war, cold war, cyber war, whatever war, Aussie Prime Minister Scott Morrison said in a recent interview with CBS News that a war between the U.S. and China could break out if cooler diplomatic heads don't prevail. He was responding to a recent article written by his predecessor, Kevin Rudd, who warned of a potential hot war, that is, an armed conflict between the U.S. and China in the run-up to the U.S. presidential elections in November.
Well, our defence update expresses it differently and certainly not as dramatically as Kevin has. But in our own defence update, we've acknowledged that what was previously inconceivable and not considered even possible or likely in terms of those types of outcomes is not considered in those contexts anymore.
Prime Minister Morrison has called on China to enhance regional and global stability rather than, he says, focusing on a narrow national or aspirational interest, while also urging the U.S. and Trump administration to resolve its own issues with China on trade, security, and international law.
How would you describe what not one, but two prime ministers of Australia are declaring?
Well, first, let me begin, Rick, by just noting that I believe that we have entered the phase of Cold War II. This is pretty much the case now after China's actions over the last 6 months, beginning with the spread of COVID. As to the Australian prime ministers, I had a chance to read the Foreign Affairs article this morning, and I don't think there's anything that's really all that startling about either prime minister's comments that a war between China and the U.S. is no longer inconceivable, given the very accelerated militarization of the South China Sea by China, amphibious exercises to potentially invade Taiwan, the suppression of freedom and autonomy in Hong Kong, and attacks along the China-India border over 2,000 miles long. So we see a pattern of Chinese belligerence while the world is distracted by COVID and by economic devastation. But I don't believe there's any such thing as a 3-month window where war is more likely or anything like that. And I believe that there will be much cooler heads prevailing in both Washington and Beijing about any deliberate steps towards war. But the danger is, given what has been happening under Chinese belligerence in Asia and beyond, the potential for a miscalculation could lead to an escalation that no one wants to see occur.
George Galloway. George, I imagine you might disagree with what Mr. Sidolides has to say.
Well, that was the world as viewed through the looking glass, where words mean exactly what you decide that they mean. And in many cases, those statements were the precise opposite of the truth. It's not China that's got warships in the South American Sea. It's America that's got warships in the South China Sea. It's not China that's got nuclear-armed aeroplanes off the coast of China. It's the other way around. The belligerence is all on the other side than has just been asserted. But we both agree on this, that there is nothing all that remarkable about what two Australian prime ministers have said, because trade wars, cyber wars, propaganda wars, cold wars oftentimes pave the way to hot war. And if that hot war breaks out, then of course we're in, if you'll forgive the pun, completely uncharted waters. Will it be a conventional war? Will it escalate to short-range nuclear missiles? Will it escalate to intercontinental ballistic missiles, in which case you and I will never talk again, Rick, because the world will be at an end. The insouciance with which some people approach these existential questions, ending of Earth and the human race questions, is quite frankly staggering. Now, Wag the Dog was not just a movie. Bill Clinton, in my lifetime, killed one of my friends, the finest woman painter in the Arab world, Leila Al-Atta, as a Wag the Dog maneuver to distract attention from the failings of his administration. And Donald Trump has more than Bill Clinton's problems right now, just a few months out from the presidential election.